Not a single guest showed up to the birthday party of a paralyzed CEO, even though hundreds of powerful people had promised they would come. By 7 o'clock that evening, the grand ballroom held nothing but Emma Lawson, an uncut birthday cake, and rows upon rows of empty chairs, stretching into silence. She looked around the room, then said quietly to no one, "So this is what power actually looks like." She was about to leave when the doors burst open. A black, single father walked in, holding the hand of his little girl, and within minutes every person left in that building was standing completely still. What did he do? If stories like this one stay with you, hit subscribe. There's more where this came from. Emma Lawson had not always been the kind of woman people felt sorry for. For most of her adult life, she had been the kind of woman people envied, the one whose name appeared on the covers of business magazines, whose company had reshaped the way hospitals managed patient data across the country, whose voice carried enough weight in a boardroom to silence a room full of men twice her age. She had built all of it herself, from a one-bedroom apartment in Chicago with a second-hand laptop and a business plan. She rewrote 17 times before she felt it was ready. By the time she turned 43, Lawson Technologies employed over 4,000 people, and Emma had every reason to believe the next chapter of her life would be just as relentless and just as bright. Then came the accident. It happened on a Tuesday evening in November on a rain-slicked overpass outside the city. A truck ran a red light and hit her car on the driver's side at full speed. The doctors later told her that she was lucky to be alive, and she supposed they were right, though in those first weeks in the hospital, she had not felt particularly lucky. The crash had fractured 3 vertebrae in her lower spine. When the surgeries were done and the swelling had gone down and the specialists had reviewed every scan and image twice, over the conclusion was the same: Emma Lawson would not walk again. She was 43 years old at the peak of her career, and she would spend the rest of her life in a wheelchair. What surprised her most in the months that followed was not the physical adjustment, as brutal as that was, but how quickly the world around her shifted. The calls kept coming at first. Colleagues checked in, board members sent flowers, journalists wrote thoughtful pieces about her resilience. But somewhere around the 3rd month, the rhythm changed. The calls grew shorter. The visits became less frequent. People still respected her, or at least they respected what her name could do for them. But something in the way they looked at her had changed. There was a hesitation in their eyes that had never been there before. A split second of recalibration every time she rolled into a room, as if they were quietly deciding how much of the old Emma was still worth investing in. She noticed it every time, and she never said a word about it. She told herself it did not matter. She had her company. She had her work. She had the kind of schedule that left no room for self-pity. But on the quiet evenings when the office had emptied and the city hummed 14 floors below her window, she was aware of something she could not quite name, a hollow feeling that sat just beneath the surface of everything she had built, waiting. Marcus Carter's Tuesday evenings looked nothing like Emma's. By the time she was finishing late dinners with investors in downtown restaurants, Marcus was usually on his 3rd delivery of the night, navigating his battered gray van through traffic with one hand on the wheel and a cold cup of coffee in the cup holder he hadn't touched in an hour. He was 38 years old, broad-shouldered and perpetually running 5 minutes behind schedule, not because he was careless, but because he had a habit of taking the stairs when a building's elevator was broken, rather than making the elderly residents carry their own packages up 4 flights. His dispatcher had spoken to him about it twice. Marcus had nodded both times and continued taking the stairs. He had been doing this job for 6 years, ever since his wife Diane died of an aggressive form of cancer that moved faster than any of the treatments could. Lily had been 2 years old. Marcus had held it together in the way that people hold things together when they have no other choice, quietly, stubbornly, one day at a time. He had picked up the delivery job because the hours were flexible enough to work around Lily's school schedule, and because it required enough physical movement to keep his mind from going to places he couldn't afford to visit during working hours. It was not the life he had imagined for himself, but it was a life he had built with his own hands, and he was not ashamed of it. Lily was 8 years old and had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness. She had a habit of carrying a small notebook in the front pocket of her jacket, not for writing, but for drawing. She drew everything: the pigeons outside their apartment window, the old man who sold hot dogs on the corner, the faces of strangers on the subway who looked like they were thinking about something sad. And sometimes when she sensed that a person was hurting, even if they hadn't said so, she would tear a page from her notebook, write something on it, fold it carefully in half, and leave it where they would find it. Marcus had never told her to do this. It was simply something she did the way some children collect rocks or memorize facts about dinosaurs. He thought Diane would have loved it. On the night of Emma's birthday, Marcus had brought Lily along because his usual babysitter had canceled at the last minute, and he had 3 deliveries left on his route. Lily was used to this. She kept a small backpack with her notebook, a box of colored pencils, and a granola bar, and she could entertain herself in the passenger seat or a hotel lobby for as long as she needed to. That night, his last delivery was to the Meridian Grand, one of the city's oldest and most expensive hotels, the kind of place with a doorman in white gloves and marble floors polished to a mirror finish. Marcus pulled his van around to the service entrance, told Lily to wait on the bench just inside the lobby, and went to sign in with the loading dock manager. He was on his way back through the corridor when he heard 2 of the hotel's front desk staff talking in lowered voices near the service elevator. They weren't trying to be quiet enough, and the corridor carried sound well. One of them said that the woman in the grand ballroom had been sitting alone for over 40 minutes now. The other said she'd heard all the guests had canceled. The first one shook her head and said it was the saddest thing she'd seen all year. All those empty chairs, all that food, and the woman just sitting there in her wheelchair by the cake, like she was waiting for something that wasn't coming. Marcus slowed his steps. He told himself it was none of his business. He had 2 more stops after this, and Lily needed to be in bed by 9:30. He was still telling himself this when he turned the corner and found Lily standing up from the bench, her nose pressed to the narrow window of the ballroom's side door, her breath fogging the glass. She turned when she heard him and looked up with an expression he recognized, the same one she wore when she saw something that didn't sit right with her, something that needed to be fixed, even if no one had asked her to fix it. "Dad," she said. "Why is that lady sitting by herself? It's her birthday. There's a whole cake." Marcus looked through the window. He could see the edge of the ballroom from there, the long sweep of white tablecloths, the flowers, the untouched food, and at the center of it all, a woman in a wheelchair, with her back very straight and her hands folded in her lap, looking at nothing. "I don't know, baby," he said. Lily looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back through the window. Then she said very simply, "We should go in." Marcus stood there for a long moment with his hand on his daughter's shoulder. He was aware with complete clarity of every reason not to walk through that door. He was a delivery driver in a uniform that still had a coffee stain on the sleeve from that morning. He did not know this woman. He had not been invited. The ballroom on the other side of that door cost more per evening than he made in a month, and every signal in the world was telling him that he did not belong in it. He thought about all of this, and then he looked at his daughter, 8 years old, already reaching into her jacket pocket for her notebook, and he understood that if he walked away right now, he would be teaching her something he did not want her to learn. He bought a small box of pastries from the hotel's cafe kiosk near the lobby, the kind he had planned to give Lily as a treat on the way home. It wasn't much. It wasn't the right kind of gift for a birthday party in a ballroom like that one. But it was what he had, and Marcus Carter had never in his life shown up to something empty-handed. He tucked the box under his arm, took Lily's hand, and pushed open the door. The ballroom was even larger from the inside. Marcus had caught only a sliver of it through the corridor window, but standing in the doorway now holding Lily's hand and a small box of pastries, he understood just how wrong the 2 of them looked in this room. The ceilings were high and gilded. The chandeliers threw warm light across tables draped in white linen, each one set with crystal glasses and silver cutlery that had never been touched. There were flowers everywhere, tall arrangements of white roses and eucalyptus that must have cost more than Marcus made in a week. And in the middle of all of it, at the head of the long center table, sat Emma Lawson, her posture immaculate, her expression unreadable, like a woman who had decided a long time ago that she would not let the world see her flinch. She heard them come in and turned her wheelchair slowly to face the door. Her eyes moved from Marcus to Lily, then back to Marcus, and for a moment none of them said anything. Marcus was acutely aware of the coffee stain on his sleeve, of the small cardboard box in his hand, of the fact that his work boots had left faint marks on the polished floor. He had walked into a lot of places in his life that made him feel like he didn't belong, and this was one of them. But he had come this far, and he was not going to let that feeling win. "I'm sorry to just walk in like this," he said. His voice came out steadier than he expected. "My name is Marcus. I was making a delivery here tonight. My daughter saw you through the window and—" He stopped because he wasn't sure how to finish that sentence without making it sound worse than it already did. Lily, who had no such hesitation, stepped forward and looked up at Emma with the same directness she used when she wanted to know why the sky changed colors at sunset. "It's your birthday," Lily said. "We didn't want you to be alone." Emma looked at the little girl for a long moment. Something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, not quite anything she had a name for. "How do you know it's my birthday?" she asked. Lily pointed at the banner strung above the far wall. "Happy Birthday, Emma," in gold letters that suddenly seemed to Marcus like the saddest decoration he had ever seen. Emma followed the direction of Lily's finger, looked at the banner, and then looked back at her hands in her lap. "Right," she said quietly. Marcus set the box of pastries on the nearest table. It looked absurd next to the untouched 5-course meal arranged along the buffet, and pulled out a chair a few feet from Emma, not so close as to crowd her, not so far as to make the gesture meaningless. Lily climbed into the chair beside him, pulled her notebook from her jacket pocket, and opened it to a blank page with the ease of someone settling in for the long haul. The silence between the three of them was awkward and strange, but it was also somehow less suffocating than the silence that had filled the room before they arrived. It was Lily who broke it. She had been drawing something with a short red pencil, pressing lightly on the paper, the way she always did when she was thinking. Without looking up, she tore the page carefully along the edge, folded it in half, and held it out toward Emma. Emma took it slowly. She unfolded it and read what was written there in a child's uneven handwriting, the letters slightly too large, and leaning a little to the right, "Nobody deserves to feel forgotten." Emma did not make a sound, but her jaw tightened, and her eyes filled quickly, the way eyes fill when a person has been holding something back for a long time, and suddenly, without warning, the thing they've been holding back finds a door. She pressed her lips together and looked down at the piece of paper, and Marcus looked away to give her a moment of privacy that the room could not otherwise offer. Lily watched Emma with calm, open curiosity, the way children watch things that adults would pretend not to notice. She did not say anything else. She had already said what needed to be said. Marcus let the quiet settle for a few seconds before he stood up from the table. He had noticed the hotel staff moving at the edges of the room, a woman in a catering uniform quietly reorganizing plates that didn't need reorganizing, a young man near the buffet pretending to adjust a serving tray. There was a pianist at the far end of the room who had been playing the same gentle loop of music since they walked in, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if he were trying to take up as little space as possible. Marcus had spent enough years being the person in the background of other people's important evenings to recognize the particular way these workers were holding themselves present, invisible, and doing their best to stay that way. He walked over to the woman in the catering uniform first. Her name tag said Renee. She looked up when he approached, clearly uncertain about what a man in a delivery uniform wanted from her in the middle of a ballroom. Marcus kept his voice low and his manner easy. "The food's going to go to waste if nobody eats it," he said. "And there are enough chairs here for all of you. I think she'd be glad for the company, the real kind." Renee glanced over at Emma, then back at Marcus, and said she didn't think that was how it was supposed to work. Marcus nodded and said he understood that, and that she was absolutely right, and that the food would still go to waste either way, so she might as well eat something while it was warm. He moved through the room the same way, unhurried, matter-of-fact, speaking to each person, as if what he was suggesting was the most reasonable thing in the world. The security guard near the side door, a heavy-set man named Dale, who had worked the hotel for 11 years and had eaten dinner standing up every night he'd worked. The two young servers who had spent the last hour carrying trays of food back and forth between the kitchen and a room where no one was eating. The head chef who had come out from the kitchen to check on the buffet and ended up staying in the doorway watching the empty room with the expression of someone who had cooked for 30 years and could not abide waste. The pianist whose name turned out to be Gerald and who had been playing background music for events at this hotel for longer than Marcus had been driving a van. Each of them hesitated. Each of them looked at Emma, and one by one they set down what they were holding and walked to the table. It did not happen in a rush. It happened the way good things usually happen, slowly, a little awkwardly, with people unsure of exactly where to sit or what to say. Renee took the chair across from Lily. Dale settled into a seat near the end of the table, with the careful movements of a man whose knees weren't what they used to be. The two servers sat together still in their uniforms, and one of them poured glasses of sparkling water for everyone at the table as though it were the most natural thing in the world because it was the only thing she knew how to do in a room like this, and she wanted to contribute something. Gerald stopped playing the ambient loop and started playing something warmer, something that had a melody you could actually follow, and the music changed the temperature of the room in a way that was hard to explain, but immediately felt by everyone present. Lily had moved her chair closer to Emma's and was showing her the drawings in her notebook, not shyly, but with the confidence of someone sharing something they were genuinely proud of. Emma leaned in to look, and the expression on her face was one that none of her board members had ever seen, unguarded, a little wondering, entirely present. She asked Lily about the drawings, and Lily explained each one with the gravity of a curator walking someone through an important exhibit. The pigeon on the windowsill had a broken foot, which was why she'd drawn it. She thought broken things were worth drawing because people usually looked away from them. Emma listened to this and did not say anything for a moment. Then she said that she thought Lily was probably right about that. Marcus sat down and ate. The food was extraordinary, of course it was in a hotel like this, but that was not what made the meal what it was. What made it what it was had nothing to do with the menu or the flowers or the chandeliers still burning warmly above them. It was the sound of Dale laughing at something one of the servers said. It was Renee cutting a piece of cake without waiting for anyone to tell her it was time, and sliding the first slice to Lily because Lily was a child, and children should always get cake first. It was Gerald playing something that sounded, if you listened carefully, like a song someone had once danced to at a wedding. Emma sat at the center of it all, and for a long stretch of time she did not speak very much. She listened, she watched, and somewhere between the second piece of cake and Gerald finishing his third song, she became aware that she was not performing anything, not authority, not resilience, not the careful image she had maintained for 20 years in rooms far more powerful than this one. She was just a woman at a table with a delivery driver and his daughter and a handful of hotel workers who had nowhere better to be, and it was the realest she had felt in longer than she could remember. When the evening wound down and people began drifting back to their posts, Marcus started gathering his things. Emma watched him and said with the directness of someone who did not often allow herself to be grateful out loud that she didn't know how to thank him for what he'd done. Marcus shook his head and reached for Lily's jacket, holding it open so she could slide her arms in. "Lily wanted to come in," he said. I just followed her. Emma looked at him for a moment, then looked at Lily, who was zipping her jacket with full concentration. She's remarkable, Emma said. Marcus smiled the quiet, private kind. I know, he said. She gets that from her mother. He said goodnight. Lily waved with both hands, and as the door swung shut behind them, Emma sat alone again in the ballroom, but it was not the same alone as before. The chandeliers were still burning. Gerald's last cord was still fading, and on the table in front of her, folded in half and slightly creased from where she had held it too tightly, was a piece of notebook paper with 9 words written in a child's unsteady hand. She set it down carefully like something she intended to keep. Emma did not sleep that night. She sat by the window of her hotel suite with the city spread out below her in its usual indifferent blaze of light, and she thought about every person who had confirmed their attendance and then quietly disappeared. She thought about the way they had phrased their cancellations politely, each one with a reason that was just plausible enough to be unchallengeable. A conflict that came up, a family matter, an early flight. She had accepted each message with the composure she had spent decades perfecting, and she had told herself it was fine that these things happened, that she was not the kind of woman who needed a room full of people to feel like herself. She had believed that right up until the moment she was actually sitting alone in that room and found out that she had been wrong. What stayed with her was not the humiliation of the empty chairs. It was the contrast. The people who had not come were people she had known for years, people she had invested in, advocated for, shared tables with, at events far more exclusive than this one. And the people who had stayed were a delivery driver who owed her nothing, a child who barely came up to her shoulder, a security guard with bad knees, a chef who hadn't planned to leave the kitchen, and a pianist who had simply been told to play until someone told him to stop. None of them had stayed because it benefited them. They had stayed because a little girl had decided that no one should feel forgotten on their birthday, and the rest of them had followed that logic because when stripped of every professional calculation, it was the only logic that actually made sense. Emma sat with that for a long time, and by the time the city outside began to lighten at its edges, she had arrived at something she could not unfeel. The entire structure of her professional life had been built on the assumption that power and loyalty traveled together, that the higher you climbed, the more secure your relationships became. That success was a kind of protection. The night had not just contradicted that assumption, it had dismantled it completely, and with a gentleness that was somehow worse than any direct confrontation could have been. She had not been attacked. She had simply been shown the truth by a child with a red pencil and a torn piece of notebook paper. She knew sitting there that she could not go back to running her company the way she had been running it. Not because it wasn't profitable, it was extraordinarily so, but because she no longer trusted the version of herself that had built it. That version had known how to optimize, how to scale, how to position. What she had apparently not known was how to build anything that would hold her weight when she actually needed it to. It took her 3 weeks to find Marcus. His company's dispatch system had a record of the delivery to the Meridian Grand, and from there it was not complicated. She called him on a Wednesday afternoon, and he picked up on the 4th ring with the slightly distracted tone of someone who was in the middle of something physical. She introduced herself, and there was a brief silence on the line before he said with genuine surprise, "How did you get this number?" Emma explained briefly that she had resources and that she had used them, and then she told him why she was calling. She had been establishing a foundation, one focused on supporting people with disabilities, single parents and families navigating the kind of sudden destabilizing hardship that institutions were slow to address and individuals were too exhausted to fight alone. She had been thinking carefully about who should lead its community development work. She wanted that person to be him. Marcus's response was immediate and flat. "No," he said. Emma had expected this. She asked him why, and he said without any apparent resentment that she needed someone with a degree in nonprofit management or public administration, someone who knew how to write grants and navigate bureaucratic systems and speak the language of people who sat on foundation boards. He did not have any of those things, and he was not going to pretend otherwise just because she had seen him do something decent on one particular evening. Emma listened to all of this without interrupting. Then she asked him one question. "What made you walk through that door?" There was a longer silence this time. She could hear faintly the sound of traffic on his end of the call. When he spoke again, his voice was a little quieter. He said he didn't know exactly. He said Lily had looked at him in a way that made walking away feel like a choice he would have to explain to her someday, and he hadn't been able to think of an explanation he was willing to give. Emma said that was precisely why she was calling him. He told her he needed to think about it, and she said she understood, and they ended the call. He did not think about it the way she probably imagined he would. He did not make a list of pros and cons or research the foundation or call anyone for advice. What he did was spend the next 4 days going about his regular route, and every time he found himself at a door, a walk-up in a building with a broken elevator, a ground-floor apartment where he could hear a television too loud, and a child crying quietly underneath it, a house where the porch light was out and no one had replaced it. He thought about what Emma had said. He thought about what it meant to actually understand what people needed versus what it meant to have the vocabulary to describe it in a boardroom. He had spent 6 years moving through the invisible architecture of other people's hardship, delivering things to addresses that the rest of the city preferred not to think about too carefully. He knew things about those addresses that no graduate program had taught anyone. What held him back was not humility exactly. It was fear, a specific and well-founded fear that he would step into a world where the rules were written in a language he didn't speak, and that he would fail in front of Lily, who was watching everything he did with the quiet attention of someone taking notes. She was 8 years old, and she already understood that her father was the kind of man who did not quit things. He did not want to give her the experience of watching him be destroyed by something he had no business attempting. It seemed irresponsible. It seemed like the kind of decision a person made because a moment had felt meaningful, and moments he knew were not the same as plans. He was on the last delivery of his Thursday route, standing in the elevator of a building on the south side, when Lily, who was with him again that evening because of a teacher professional development day, looked up from her notebook and said without preamble, "Are you going to do the job that lady called about?" Marcus looked down at her. He asked how she knew about that. Lily said she had heard him on the phone and that he had the same face he got when he was trying to talk himself out of something. Marcus asked what face that was. Lily said it was the same face he'd had in the hallway of the Meridian Grand, right before he pushed the door open. He called Emma the next morning and told her he would do it. He made 2 things clear: that he would not pretend to be something he wasn't, and that if the board expected him to perform a role that required him to abandon the instincts that had made her call him in the first place, then the arrangement would not work. Emma said that those were exactly the terms she was hoping he'd name. The Board of Lawson Technologies did not take the announcement quietly. When they learned that Emma intended to appoint a delivery driver with no formal credentials as Director of Community Development of the new foundation, 3 board members requested an emergency meeting within 24 hours. Emma let them speak. She did not interrupt the concerns about credentials, about public perception, about the precedent it set. She gave every objection the air it needed to be fully stated. Then, she said, a man walked into an empty room on a night when everyone else decided it was more convenient to stay away. He didn't do it because he had a strategy. He didn't do it because there was anything in it for him. He did it because his daughter asked him a question he couldn't answer any other way. And because of that, a room full of people who spend every working hour being invisible to each other sat down at the same table and chose to be human for an evening. She let that land before she continued. If you can show me a credential that teaches that, I will consider your candidate. Until then, Marcus Carter is my Director of Community Development, and that is not a decision that is on the table. 2 board members resigned within the week. Emma accepted their resignations without drama and began the process of replacing them. Marcus, for his part, read none of the press coverage that followed. He had enough to do learning the operational side of a foundation whose annual budget was larger than anything he had previously held in his head as a real number. He was not a natural fit for conference rooms. He said too little in formal meetings and too much in informal ones. He had no patience for language that obscured rather than communicated. But he knew which neighborhoods the grants needed to reach and why. He knew which program structures would be ignored by the people they were designed to help because they required paperwork that assumed a level of stability those people did not have. He knew in the way that only direct experience teaches what the difference was between aid that made the giver feel useful and aid that actually changed anything. The foundation staff found him disorienting at first and then gradually indispensable. 1 year after the night at the Meridian Grand, Emma's birthday arrived again. She had booked the same ballroom. The flowers were different this time. Wildflowers, mostly in loose arrangements that looked like something someone might pick on the way to a party rather than something composed by a professional. The tables were set without a seating chart. The guest list had no VIPs. It had families who had received support from the foundation in its first year of operation. It had people who used wheelchairs and people who didn't. It had single parents who couldn't find childcare and had brought their kids anyway, and the kids were running between the tables, and no one was asking them to stop. Renee from the catering team was there. Emma had called her personally 2 weeks earlier, told her she was welcome as a guest, this time not as staff, and Renee had laughed in a way that suggested she hadn't been expecting the call, but was glad it came. Dale was there too, having retired 2 months prior. He arrived early, found a seat near the end of the table, with the careful movements of a man whose knees still weren't what they used to be, and looked significantly more relaxed than the last time Emma had seen him. Gerald was at the piano again. Emma had reached out to him through the hotel after the first party told him she wanted to hire him for the following year's event, and Gerald had agreed without needing much convincing because he had spent that first evening playing something real for the first time in years and had not forgotten what that felt like. Marcus and Lily sat at the table closest to Emma's. Lily was wearing a yellow dress and had her notebook, as always, in her lap. She was drawing the wildflowers. Emma watched her for a moment and thought about a night 1 year ago when an 8-year-old had pressed her face to a corridor window and asked why a woman was sitting alone, and how that question, so small, so direct, so entirely unconcerned with the protocol of the situation, had been the thing that changed the course of what came after. Emma looked around the room. Every chair was filled. She had not planned for that, had not counted, had not coordinated, had simply opened the door and let people in, and somehow every chair was filled. She thought about what she had believed for most of her life that a full room meant. She thought about how wrong she had been and how long it had taken one empty room to show her. She picked up her glass and held it toward Marcus. He picked up his and touched the rim to hers without ceremony, the way people do when the gesture is too real to require any performance. Lily looked up from her drawing, decided this was sufficient cause to reach for her own glass of lemonade, and joined them with the solemnity of someone who understood that something worth marking was being marked. The three of them drank. The room moved and breathed around them, full of noise and children and people who had no reason to be anywhere else. It was, Emma thought, exactly enough. Sometimes the person who changes your life isn't the most powerful one in the room, they're just the only one who was willing to walk in. If this story reminded you that kindness still exists in the world, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe. We'll be here every time you need to be reminded that people are still capable of surprising you.